The phone call came at 2:14 in the morning, Beirut time, not to a general, not to a foreign minister, to a low-level diplomatic aide working out of a temporary office that hadn't even been officially registered yet. The message was short. The ceasefire framework had been initialed. The border demarcation language had held. And within 48 hours, Benjamin Netanyahu would stand before cameras and call it something he hadn't called anything in years, a historic achievement. That phrase, historic achievement, stopped a lot of people. Because Netanyahu has been in Israeli politics for 3 decades. He has survived wars, indictments, coalition collapses, and 2 intifadas. He does not use words like historic casually. When he does, it usually means one of 2 things. Either something genuinely significant just happened, or he needs the public to believe it did. And here is where the story gets complicated, because this deal, this framework between Israel and Lebanon, looks very different, depending on which layer you're examining. On the surface, it's a diplomatic breakthrough. 2 countries with no formal peace treaty, separated by one of the most militarized borders in the Middle East, just agreed to a set of parameters that neither side has agreed to in decades. But that's not the real story. The real story is what this deal reveals about the shifting architecture of power in the Middle East. Who needed it more, who gave up more to get it, and what it signals about where the region is heading now that the dust from the last major escalation cycle is beginning to settle. So the question isn't whether this is a real achievement. The question is, an achievement for whom, on whose terms, and at what cost to the assumptions that govern this border for the last 20 years. Hi, I'm Susan, and what we're going to do today is go far beyond the surface of what's been reported, because most of the coverage you'll see on this deal will frame it one of 2 ways, either as a historic peace milestone or as a political lifeline for a prime minister under domestic pressure. Both of those framings contain pieces of the truth, but neither of them captures what this agreement actually represents structurally, what it changes, what it leaves unresolved, and what it signals to every other actor in the region who is watching very carefully right now. In this video, we're going to break down 3 things. First, the actual background, how this border became one of the most contested strips of land in the Middle East, and what assumption had to collapse before both sides were willing to sit down. Second, what's actually in this deal, and what officials on both sides are carefully not saying publicly. And third, what it means beyond the obvious, for Hezbollah, for Iran, for U.S. influence in the region, and for the populations on both sides of that border who have been living under the weight of this conflict for most of their lives. Because once you see the full picture, this stops looking like a diplomatic triumph and starts looking like something more complicated and more consequential than any single headline can hold. If you follow this channel, you know we don't chase noise. We follow leverage. And right now, the leverage in this story is not where most people are looking. To understand what just happened, you have to understand what this border was and what it was supposed to be. The blue line, the boundary between Israel and Lebanon, was drawn not by a peace treaty but by a UN withdrawal confirmation following Israel's pullout from southern Lebanon in the year 2000. It was never formally ratified by both governments. It was never accompanied by normalized relations. It was, in the most precise sense, a ceasefire geography, a line that said, stop here, without ever resolving why the conflict existed in the first place. For more than 2 decades, that ambiguity was managed but never resolved. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militant group and political party backed by Iran, established itself in southern Lebanon in the years after Israel's withdrawal, building what military analysts would eventually describe as one of the most sophisticated non-state armed organizations in the world. By the time of the 2006 war, 34 days of fighting that ended without a clear victor, Hezbollah had demonstrated it could absorb Israeli airstrikes, sustain rocket fire, and emerge from the conflict with its political position inside Lebanon stronger, not weaker. That dynamic defined the next 17 years. UN Security Council Resolution 1701, passed at the end of the 2006 war, called for the disarmament of armed groups south of the Litani River and the deployment of Lebanese army forces to fill the vacuum. Neither happened. Hezbollah rebuilt. Its arsenal expanded. Independent arms monitors estimated that by 2023 the group held somewhere between 130,000 and 150,000 rockets and missiles, a figure that represented an exponential leap from the roughly 14,000 it possessed before the 2006 war. And Israel, watching this buildup across its northern border, faced a strategic dilemma that had no clean solution. A preemptive strike on Hezbollah's arsenal risked escalating into a full regional war at a time of Israel's choosing, but not necessarily on terms favorable to Israel. Tolerating the buildup meant accepting a growing threat that would eventually have to be confronted, and the political dynamics inside Lebanon made any Lebanese government solution essentially impossible, Hezbollah's integration into the state, through its parliamentary bloc and cabinet positions, meant that Beirut could not disarm what it could not fully control. That was the old world. That was the baseline assumption that governed this border for nearly 2 decades. And then beginning in late 2023, that baseline began to fracture. The spillover from the Gaza conflict changed the operational tempo along the northern border in ways that neither side had fully planned for. Cross-border exchanges that had previously been contained, occasional anti-tank missiles, retaliatory strikes, calibrated escalation that stayed below the threshold of full war began to intensify. Tens of thousands of Israelis were evacuated from communities in the north. Hezbollah fired at a pace that hadn't been seen since 2006. Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon began targeting infrastructure at a depth and frequency that signaled a different kind of campaign. By the time a negotiated framework became possible, both sides had absorbed real costs, and that's when the calculation changed. So what's actually in this deal, and why does the gap between the public version and the operational version matter so much? The publicly announced framework includes several elements that have been reported across multiple outlets. A phased Israeli withdrawal from positions it had taken in southern Lebanon during the escalation period, a commitment from the Lebanese armed forces to extend their presence in the south, international monitoring mechanisms, primarily French and American, to verify compliance and language around the blue line that represents the first formal attempt in years to address specific disputed areas along the boundary. On paper, this looks like a comprehensive framework. In reality, the 3 most consequential elements of what was negotiated are the ones receiving the least sustained attention. The first is the question of Hezbollah's weapons. The framework, according to multiple officials familiar with the negotiations, does not include direct language requiring Hezbollah's disarmament. What it includes instead is a formulation that commits Lebanon, meaning the Lebanese state, to ensuring that armed forces south of the Litani are under state authority. That is a meaningful distinction. It places the burden of implementation on a government that has spent 17 years demonstrating it cannot enforce this requirement. Israeli officials know this. American mediators know this. The question is what the enforcement mechanism looks like when the Lebanese government inevitably fails to deliver. That response, or rather the absence of a clear enforcement clause, is where the story really begins. The second element is the timeline. Phased withdrawals and phased deployments are structured with what one diplomatic source described only as benchmarks tied to security conditions on the ground. That language, which sounds technical and reassuring, is actually a pressure valve. It means both sides retain the ability to slow-roll implementation by citing security conditions, and it means that the mechanism for declaring a benchmark met is itself subject to negotiation. The third is what Israel did not give up. Netanyahu's framing of this as a historic achievement tracks against a specific set of Israeli objectives that were defined before the negotiation began. Israeli officials had stated publicly, and in more detail privately, that any framework would need to include international recognition of Israel's right to act militarily inside Lebanon if Hezbollah violations were detected, a mechanism for Israel to verify Lebanese armed forces deployment independently, and resolution of at least some of the disputed Blue Line territory in Israel's favor. Reports from Israeli media, specifically Haaretz and Channel 12, confirmed that all 3 of these elements are present in the initialed framework in some form. Netanyahu is not wrong when he calls this an achievement. He is simply choosing which achievement to emphasize, which raises the question no official is willing to answer directly: if Hezbollah doesn't formally sign this agreement, if it is not party to the framework in any documented way, what exactly has been agreed? And that brings us to the part most headlines are missing entirely. If you're starting to see how different this story looks beneath the surface, how it's less about peace and more about competing definitions of leverage, this is exactly the kind of analysis we're going to keep building on. If you find value in breakdowns that go beyond the political framing and follow the structural mechanics, take a moment to support this channel with a like. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. And now let's get into the layer of the story that changes the regional picture entirely. The systemic significance of this deal is not the deal itself. It's what the deal reveals about how much the regional power architecture has shifted, and who is now operating from a position of greater structural confidence than they were 18 months ago. Start with Hezbollah. The conventional reading is that Hezbollah has been weakened, that the escalation cycle cost its senior commanders, degraded its logistics, and created enough pressure that its patron Iran signaled it was time to step back from the threshold. That reading is not wrong, it is incomplete. Because Hezbollah's survival as an organization, its continued existence as an armed force, its continued presence in Lebanese political institutions, and its continued connection to Iranian supply lines is itself a strategic outcome. The group did not disarm, it did not lose its political position, and the framework that has now been initialed does not fundamentally alter either of those facts. What Hezbollah lost in this cycle, it can rebuild. What it retained, the legitimacy of its armed status within Lebanese politics, the infrastructure of its regional network, is not addressed by this agreement. This is the same logic that operated after 2006. The same structure appeared in the post-war period then: a ceasefire framework, a UN resolution, commitments by the Lebanese state, and a Hezbollah that used the recovery period to emerge stronger than before. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. For Iran, the calculus is different, but equally important. Tehran's regional strategy has never depended on any single actor winning any single engagement. It depends on maintaining what analysts sometimes call the axis of resistance, a network of relationships, supply chains, and political assets that stretches from Tehran through Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Gaza. The Hezbollah-Israel framework, from Iran's perspective, preserves the Lebanese node of that network. It does not sever it, and it does not eliminate Iran's ability to reconstitute Hezbollah's capabilities over time through the same corridors that have survived every previous attempt to close them. And here's where this stops looking reactive and starts looking calculated. Iran is simultaneously managing a complex set of pressures: negotiations over its nuclear program, economic strain from sanctions, internal political dynamics following its leadership transition, and ongoing coordination with Russia, which has its own reasons to want U.S. attention and military resources diverted toward the Middle East rather than focused exclusively on Europe. A Hezbollah-Israel framework that stabilizes Lebanon's surface, without resolving the underlying architecture, serves Iran's medium-term interest in preserving its regional network while reducing the immediate risk of a full-scale conflict that could draw in the United States at a scale Iran is not currently positioned to absorb. Now look at how markets and military postures are responding quietly without press conferences. In the weeks leading up to the initialing of the framework, Israeli Defense Ministry procurement signals shifted. Ammunition resupply requests that had been flagged as urgent were moved to standard processing timelines. That is a market signal, a bureaucratic one, but real. It suggests Israeli defense planners assess the immediate kinetic threat as reduced, at least temporarily. In Washington, the State Department added 3 additional senior advisors to the Lebanon portfolio simultaneously, not a reduction in attention, but a doubling down. The official explanation was implementation monitoring. The operational reality, according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, is that the U.S. is deeply aware that the framework's viability depends entirely on the next 6 months of implementation, and that failure of implementation would represent a significant diplomatic cost to an administration that invested considerable political capital in brokering the deal. And in Beirut, where the political landscape is always the most telling indicator, the response from Lebanon's political class has been notably fractured. The Prime Minister's office welcomed the framework. The Amal movement, Hezbollah's Shia political ally, issued a statement that was supportive in form, but conspicuously absent of specific endorsement of the verification mechanisms. The Lebanese Forces, the Christian party that is broadly anti-Hezbollah, called the framework a step forward while immediately calling for full implementation of Resolution 1701. Those are 3 different parties reading 3 different deals in the same text. That's not accidental. That's the architecture of Lebanese politics, which has survived decades by making ambiguity a form of governance. This doesn't stay abstract for long. For the people living in northern Israel, the roughly 60,000 to 80,000 residents who were displaced from communities along the border during the escalation period, some for more than a year, this deal represents the possibility of going home. That is not a small thing. These are communities whose schools have been empty, whose agricultural land has gone unworked, whose economic activity essentially ceased. The Israeli government had faced mounting political pressure over the displacement, with mayors and local officials publicly criticizing the duration of the security situation. For Lebanese civilians in the south, a population that has now lived through 2 major Israeli military campaigns, in 2006 and in the most recent escalation, the framework offers something that is not quite peace but is materially different from active conflict. Infrastructure in southern Lebanon sustained significant damage. According to UNOCHA assessments, tens of thousands of Lebanese civilians were displaced during the most recent escalation period. The Lebanese economy, already in one of the most severe fiscal crises of any country in the modern era, cannot absorb another reconstruction cycle without massive external assistance. So there are 3 realistic forward scenarios here, not predictions, but the paths that the evidence points toward. In the first scenario, implementation holds in the near term. Israeli forces complete their phased withdrawal. Lebanese armed forces deploy to at least the visible checkpoints in the south. The international monitoring mechanism functions without major incidents for the first 6 months. This doesn't resolve the underlying conflict, but it creates a stabilization period of potentially 2 to 3 years, enough for reconstruction to begin and for both sides to reset their domestic political calculations. In the second scenario, implementation fractures at the first significant test. That test will most likely be a Hezbollah weapons movement detected by Israeli intelligence. Under the framework's language, Israel retains the right to act. If it does, the Lebanese government faces an impossible choice: condemn the action and face domestic political consequences, or validate it and face Hezbollah's response. That fracture point has ended every previous stabilization attempt along this border. In the third scenario, the one that officials on all sides are reluctant to name publicly, the framework serves its immediate political purpose for each party and then quietly dissolves into ambiguity with no single moment of failure but a gradual erosion of implementation that leaves the fundamental situation unchanged. If you're watching this and thinking about what the next phase of this story looks like, what the first test of this framework will be, and how it gets reported, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that breakdown. The next phase is already taking shape, and the indicators are already visible if you know where to look. So let's return to where we started. Benjamin Netanyahu called this a historic achievement. And in the narrow sense of what was achievable within the constraints of this moment, the political constraints inside Israel, the military constraints along the border, the diplomatic constraints of what Lebanon's fragmented government could actually sign onto, he may be right, but historic achievement measured against what baseline? Against the baseline of 2006's Resolution 1701, this deal represents almost no structural advance. The same commitments are being made by the same Lebanese state. The same verification challenges exist. The same Hezbollah network remains intact. Against the baseline of the last 18 months of escalation, this represents a genuine reduction in immediate risk. Civilians on both sides can begin moving back toward normal life. That matters in ways that are easy to discount when analyzing power structures and strategic architecture. The tension between those two readings, the structural and the immediate, is where this story actually lives. And it's a tension that this deal does not resolve. It manages it, for now. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The border that this framework addresses is not the border that Hezbollah and Iran consider the primary strategic frontier. The border they are managing is the broader confrontation between the regional order they are trying to build and the regional order that Israel and the United States are trying to maintain. This deal addresses one segment of that confrontation. It does not address the architecture. Netanyahu called it historic, perhaps, but history is written over decades, not press conferences. And the next chapter of this story will be written not in the language of the framework that was just signed, but in the choices made by actors who weren't in the room when it was initialed, in the first test of its verification mechanisms, and in the 6-month implementation window that everyone involved knows is the real measure of whether this was an achievement or a pause. The next phase is already taking shape. What I want to know is this: do you think a framework that leaves Hezbollah's weapons status unresolved can hold? And if it can't, what changes first?